This is SchoolHouse, Equity and Education. Welcome everyone to SchoolHouse. I am Allison Brown and I am your host. Today we're talking about the legacy of slavery and its current manifestations. I am delighted to welcome my dear friend, Dr. Natalie Hopkinson, who is an assistant professor at the Howard University School of Communications. Natalie is also a fellow at the Interactivity Foundation, which is an organization committed to supporting sustained dialogue as the critical cornerstone of the democratic process. We'll talk about that. Natalie is a journalist and author. Her books are Deconstructing Tyrone, A New Look at Black Masculinity in the Hip-Hop Generation, also Go Go Live, The Life and Death of a Chocolate City, and the soon-to-be-released A Mouth is Always Muzzled, Art in Action, Culture in Defiance. Hi, Natalie. Welcome to SchoolHouse.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we are both very proud graduates of Howard University.
Woo-woo.
And you've come full circle. You're back at Howard University.
I have.
And you're in the School of Communications.
Yes.
So you're steeped in the narrative conversations, perspective, mindset. How is that?
It's wonderful. Almost 20 years since leaving, back on campus and teaching in the PhD program and also teaching an undergraduate course this semester. And so I felt like after the election, I just really felt like I dropped in the matrix, and sort of looking at how, we're studying mass communication and studying communication theory, and propaganda, and all the research that came out of how media systems have been used to support totalitarian movements, with the rise of Hitler in Germany, the most prominent example. And it all felt really abstract and ivory towery. And then it got real.
Howard, you mean?
Well, in general, being in the academy, you think about it being divorced from reality and you're sort of this idea that you're in the ivory tower, but not so much.
Yeah, and then it played out.
It felt very real. It got very, very real on the election.
Yeah.
So it felt like all of the things that we talked about with undergrads, we talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement, looking at the role of media in those. We looked at how media systems have evolved, and they taught me a lot about social media. And so the students did, yes. And, we all had lots of great laughs and conversations about Mr. Trump. And, then suddenly it really was like a huge wake-up call. So
the power of the media.
The power of the media. And, as I alluded to in my theory class, again, you look at some of the early communications theorists, they were really trying to understand how in the world did Hitler gain power? And what role did media play in that? And a lot of those early theories have been discredited. They call them mass society theories, where they say, media really doesn't have that direct effect. And it really isn't as impactful as people fear that it is, and people have agency. Media is not like an injection thing where you just sort of take in, but, it's really forcing me to really rethink a lot of those things.
So are those theories actually now being proven true, or were they being debunked because there wasn't the kind of proliferation of media and messaging that we see now?
Think about the media landscape was much different back then. It was much simpler and less complex. But a lot of the things that you hear about internet and social media now, people were saying the same thing about radio. Actually, I was reading about this to prepare for today. People wrote think pieces about how will radio replace teachers? Will people just sit there listening to lectures and they have no need to go into the classroom?
Which is the literal conversation right now about online education.
That's literally the conversation.
Yeah.
I can pull it out.
Yeah.
Like I was looking at that, just, having a good laugh about that.
Yeah.
But there's always mass panic around media. But I think in this case, I'll just say there's a lot for us to study.
Yeah.
And a lot for us to figure out.
Well, so speaking of mass panic, Deconstructing Tyrone was your first book with Natalie Moore.
Yes.
And you were talking about Black men and Black masculinity.
Yeah.
And speaking of mass panic,
yes,
there has always been in this country mass panic around Black men and masculinity. And, just even the developing narrative right now around President Obama and the first family as the exceptions to the otherwise, completely distorted narrative about Black people. They're the exceptions, right? They're the exceptional Negroes, so to speak.
Yes.
Right. And, there's research recently about preschool teachers and Black boys in school. So the study was of teachers, and it told them that they were to really kind of think about classroom management principles. So it didn't tell them what the actual research which was to measure their implicit bias. Mm-hmm. So they were instructed to kind of look for things in the children in the classroom, one white girl, one white boy, mm-hmm. one Black girl, one Black boy. And they were instructed to look at the classroom generally and identify those potential areas of misbehavior or correction. And overwhelmingly, nearly all of the teachers studied focused on that Black boy first. And none of the kids misbehaved at all. But then coming out, they talked about that Black boy as the problem in the classroom. So all of this is about narrative and perspective and mass panic around Black masculinity.
Yeah.
And how is that manifesting right now?
What's been sort of stable about it is that, these stereotypes that lead to implicit bias have been portrayed in the media. These are messages that are very stable. Stereotypes, they work. Mm-hmm. They're very effective communication tools. As we said in our book, it's a shortcut to character development. Mm-hmm. You don't have to develop Tyrone as a character because just say the name and you're laughing. Mm-hmm. So that means you've already made a decision about who that person is and the quality of that person and, what types of person you're going to be dealing with. And so these are some of the issues that, they've just been in the media for a long time. And it's sort of like means of control. So, you open the show talking about issues around slavery. Some of these narratives really originate there and are really used to sort of perpetuate the system of slavery because without slavery, and this is what I've been doing some research on my next book that's coming out. And, you hear in the abolition movement, you hear people who were against abolition saying, well, if we let these men out, they're just going to sit around having sex with their women and our women too. Yeah. They're lazy, they don't want to work. Yeah. And the only way that they can really be part of society is to be under our tight control. Yeah. And so these were narratives that were really, since those times, and they were really narratives that sort of made us say, well, we are a civilizing influence. Yeah. And even the institution of slavery was a way to civilize these people. And wow, they are so much better off than they were back in Africa. We did them so many favors by bringing us under our civilized control and, giving them Christianity and all these things. And, these are all narratives that have been used to control the society, control Black people as a whole. And it's so heartbreaking to see that it continues in the classroom. In the preschool classroom. Yeah. Like, can they get a fresh start?
They're 3.
Can they be 3? Can they be 3? Do they have to carry the whole weight of the world and all this baggage that we have in this country that has never really been dealt with? Yeah. So that's what I'm calling a gift. The recent events is that my favorite quote is from Cornel West. Mm-hmm. Actually, it was a tweet a while ago. He was like, we shouldn't deodorize the conversation about race. Yeah. We need to let the funk rise to the surface.
Let it stink.
Let it stink. Let it stink.
Let it
smell it.
Smell up the
deal
place.
With it. Because we just been deodorizing it, really. And I think Obama, he really, not intentionally, or maybe it was intentionally. I think he was sort of like a bomb soothing everyone. Yeah. And, made a lot of us feel like we had started to turn a corner on a lot of these issues.
Yeah. You talk about civilization. So, I've been doing this research about Native American boarding schools. And the kind of trajectory to that point was, okay, we really did them wrong. And now the favor that we can do for them is to civilize them. We can give them civilization as our apology and our gift for having done them so wrong. Yeah. Because they're uncivilized.
That's right. And it's the same sort of thing. We're going to bring them under our control and man, they're so much better off now that we came and took over their
savages.
As we took over their land.
Yes. Yeah. And now we've given them this gift. It's a parallel story, but it's the same it's the same mentality. So one of the things that, you and I have talked about is the legacy of slavery. We had a conversation this weekend that really has made me kind of think about the perspective of whiteness in that story. and the history of whiteness in this country. And so the kind of dual story of the poor and low income, working class whites and blacks, and that very close connection that we've had along the way, or low income whites as overseers on the plantation and really very, closely associated with the enslaved Africans, and being given that power after having been indentured servants right there alongside the enslaved folks. And what we're seeing now, so that we've seen the closing of factories, we've seen the closing of coal mines and other things where, you have black and white working side by side. And now you have whites in positions of power in prisons and part of the mass incarceration structure. What is that story that's really kind of that shared story?
And what you just said is it's so frightening when you think about how prison stocks really went soaring, and everyone was pretty well in the private prison industry. They're very excited about it, and even
after the election,
and even doubling down about his immigration policy. That's what Trump, he said he wants to deport them or jail them, right? So if you deport them, you can't make money off of them. But if you jail them, then you can really make some money off of them. And this is anecdotal.
Yeah.
But I know like in places like West Virginia, where I do some work and I do spend some time, I've talked to young people. They have worked in the coal mines. But the new thing for them is working in prisons. So when you really think about what bones the incoming administration has to throw to all of these folks who working class white people who overwhelmingly supported him, or well, actually, I think they supported Hillary actually mostly, but the narrative anyway is that he was the one who's going to make things right for the white man. And one of the ways that fairly direct ways to do that is to give, and he's going to make more jobs. And so one of the that's just a all in one swoop. You open some more prisons. They get some more jobs.
Yep.
They're feeling good. He's reelected.
Yep.
So
how many more bodies have to go into those prisons, and what do they look like?
And it's so funny because I was talking to somebody else about this. I was, assuming that there was going to be some sort of progression in this most recent election, which turned out to be a wrong assumption. One of the things that Obama did was he said that he announced they would stop using private prisons. And so me very fancifully, maybe they'll end private schools too. Because, that's another boondoggle.
Yes.
Another money-making opportunity for people. And, all of that seems so distant, and one of the things that I have to try to fight within myself to do is to stop dreaming big and to stop thinking about bold things that we could do, especially when you look at evidence, like you're talking about in this, like this is evidence, this is science. These are things that we know. This bias is real. We do not invent it in our heads.
That's right.
And so now that we have, I feel like we've come such a long way in what we know and what we know works and what it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And if you can have an appeal to reason and evidence, then you can have hope for change. Yeah. And it's hard to believe in reason when you look at the way the campaign that has been run this year.
Yeah.
So, but the challenge, I think, is to just hold on to it. We're talking about 4 years. We should not dim our lights or lower our expectation and lower our demands for the system to be fairer.
Yeah. I think we can dream big in other ways. And the federal government is one piece of a very, very large pie of activity.
Yes.
And the Interactivity Foundation has been really supporting dialogue, conversation. And, Eric Holder, I remember being at DOJ when Eric Holder said, we are a nation of cowards because we don't talk about race. What is the role of dialogue right now, and how do we dream big around conversation and building understanding across communities?
Well, I think part of dreaming big is to not be afraid. I think that even at just a couple weeks in, people are already censoring themselves and sort of adjusting what their language is. And so that's part of it, is really sort of doubling down on conversation and dialogue and red state, blue state dialogue, it's easy to get very cynical about it. And, sort of people were already very derisively talking about, Obama's kumbaya, kumbaya-ness.
Yeah.
And, I think that we have to sort of double down on that and sort of believe that change is possible, that we are able to meet as human beings. But, I think where the Interactivity Foundation has been important is that it doesn't just happen on its own. Like, you have to create the space.
Yes.
You have to support people and make it an environment where they can do it.
Yeah.
This is not something that somebody who is working minimum wage and has children and, and all of and it really doesn't matter what socioeconomic level you're at. Like, people don't have time to just sit around and dialogue. So we have to support that, you know, and really find ways of doing that. And that's what IF has been doing in the years that I've been affiliated with them. So I'm grateful for that privilege.
Honestly, when I think about conversations on race, and this is something that I've been talking about in philanthropy, I think philanthropy needs to support, much the way Interactivity Foundation does, needs to support conversation. I have real fear, honestly, when I think about strangers coming together across racial lines to have discussion. It scares me. What are the possibilities, and how do we do it in a way that's constructive?
Well, I think that there has to be institutional level commitment. So we have to look to our community institutions, churches, schools, the gym, football games. I mean, you mentioned that, the federal government is just a small piece. And I think, those of us who are very excited about Obama administration, we sort of forgot about the private sector. And so that's one of the big differences in my next book. I'm dealing with, a country that has no private sector. The government controls 80% of the economy. I mean, your only hope of anything is through the government. And in the United States, we don't have that issue. So while the Justice Department might be run by somebody who has shown to be hostile to issues of diversity and all of those things, many people in the private sector disagree. And so, we're going to be looking for them to double down on diversity, inclusion. I mean, it's really time for them to step up to the plate and be leaders in this space. We've made some progress, in this area of dealing with all of these historic divisions and beefs and resentments. And, they're going to have to step up.
So your latest project, A Mouth is Always Muzzled. What's it about?
It's about the role of the arts in society during times of ethnic and economic strife. And it's sort of set around the Guyana diaspora. So Guyana is a Caribbean country in South America, English-speaking part of the British West Indies. And it sort of is a look at the role of the arts in society around the backdrop of their 2015 election, which was very, very crazy and contentious. And so it's sort of looking at two artists. One is a Black male poet who's a millennial, and then the other is a Indo-Guyanese painter who's in her late 60s. And so the story is told through their different perspectives on what the role of art, what it should be, what it shouldn't be in a time of real strife, drama, racial tension, economic deprivation. And as I was reporting that, it felt like fiction, how crazy it was. And it really was, I think our election ended up it wasn't quite the same. Like in Guyana, people were actually killed who were speaking out during the time that I was sort of covering this issue.
Speaking out against the way the election was going.
Speaking out against corruption. You had their attorney general had threatened one of the leading publishers, and he was recorded, and he admitted to saying that, basically threatening the publisher and saying that if they don't stop criticizing him, he would die. And then there was somebody who was sort of stood up for the publisher, and that person was killed. Like, you talk about chilling,
right? And
talk about a difficult climate to be an artist and to be somebody who speaks out. It's pretty difficult. But one of the things that in the book, going back to the idea of slavery, is a lot of those tensions really, like in the U.S., a lot of those tensions stem from slavery and economic exploitation. And it's the whole reason why that country exists. And that all these people moved into that space, were shipped from Africa and then later India to work as mostly working on sugar plantations. And one of the difference between the British, so this was British Guyana originally, one of the big difference between the way the UK ended slavery and the way the US ended slavery, it's really sort of instructive. And then to sort of have like these two, I call them twin catastrophes of Brexit and then Trump be elected. It's sort of like unresolved issues around the way that slavery ended. So in the UK, they actually had a pot of 20 million pounds that they used to pay off slave owners. Whereas in the U.S.
when slavery ended, slave owners got some portion of 20 million pounds.
Yes, 20 million pounds.
For their loss.
For their trouble. And then the slaves actually had to work an additional 4 to 6 years because it was determined that the actual value that they've lost was 45 million. And so they got this cash payout and then they got the use of the slaves for another 6 years. So it was a sweet
so they got paid and then they got additional free labor.
Yes.
After slavery.
Yes, for 4 years. Right. Yes.
Right.
The UK was 800 million pounds in debt at that time. And so it turned out to actually be a fantastic stimulus to their economy. People got to diversify. Slavery as an economic institution had outlived its usefulness. It was time to move into the industrial economy. And so this little payout was really quite useful as far as helping Great Britain make that transition.
Yeah.
And so they were able to make it much earlier than the United States was. So US, things don't end till the Civil War starts 1860.
Right.
In the US, it ends by the gun.
Yeah.
So there was no such stimulus. And I think the important part about the stimulus is that it sort of acknowledges, and the payout is that it acknowledges how much slavery helped to build up their country and how it had sort of seeped into all of their institutions. So the whole process of them paying out this money and then all these people came out the closet who owned slaves because everybody wanted to get a piece of that money.
Right.
And it really became a sort of reckoning. You saw how much the banking industry was embedded.
Yeah.
The clergy.
In the system of slavery.
Completely embedded in the system. Like pretty much every institution in British society was involved.
As here. And then there wasn't that stimulus or reparations.
And there was not that here. And so basically you just had a lot of angry people.
Yeah.
They lost their wealth.
And that white anger never went away.
It never went away. And, the thing about the UK is that there's still white anger, but I think the stimulus or the reparations that they got helped them sort of forget how they got to live how they live and how they got their privileged place in the world. And so when all these brown people that they had conquered and pillaged, when they come on their shores, they show up on their shores, they're like, oh, what are you doing here? I was like, oh, well, it's sort of, there's an amnesia around why people
that money allows for.
It does allow for that, and it also allows for like the UK. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's maybe similar to Canada. It's not to say it's a utopia, but you just don't see the same vitriol, the anger, the hatred that you'll find in parts of the United States.
So, I think in Great Britain, it's in pockets where, and folks have assumed that it's been in pockets. In the United States, right? That it's in the South, it's in the deep South, maybe some in Appalachia. Like that anger, that kind of old generational anger and hatred is just kind of in those pockets. But actually, it's not just in those pockets. And that white anger never had an outlet, or it did actually in post-Reconstruction violence and Jim Crow. Yes, but not a kind of institutional reckoning with what the loss to white community had been of the institution of slavery.
Yeah. The thing about looking at those records in the UK and the archives, which it's fantastic. You can go online and just type your name in and see who owned you if you're from the Caribbean. To look online and to kind of look at all the discussion around it. It really was a reckoning, where people were able to sort of count it was a reckoning. It was all aired. And I feel like in the US, you never had that opportunity. So now things are coming out. Oh, at Georgetown, they sold some slaves to keep Jesuit priests.
Yeah.
Stole slaves so that they could keep the university afloat.
Yeah.
This is a shock to many of us here, maybe not to certain historians, but it's a shock to us. And that's partly what this is. After the war, it was everything was sort of shrouded. Mm-hmm. Nothing was really dealt with. Mm-hmm. And it was hidden. And then that really sort of has allowed a certain level of amnesia. Mm-hmm. There was not this reckoning that really needed to happen. And it wasn't just the loss of wealth. It's a loss of privilege.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's why I feel like even in these places like Indiana, where we both live, and in the West and these, Utah and all these other states, like that's this idea of white privilege and white supremacy that they felt like was lost. And probably Obama triggered them a lot. Maybe he triggered them in ways that they didn't even realize it until they're like, oh, look at me. Look at my hand.
Yeah, I can't even help it. I can't even help myself.
Voting for Donald Trump.
So the conversation about reparations for the descendants of enslaved peoples in this country has hit a brick wall here. And I'm wondering if that brick wall is actually the notion of a stimulus. Because, you have the abrupt end to this institution that has been feeding people, that has been generating wealth for generations, and it's over.
Yep.
And then conversations about 40 acres and a mule and restitution to the folks, rightfully, to folks who've been stolen and abused,
kidnapped,
and maimed and murdered for hundreds of years on this soil, but then no conversation about what replaces that institution that's now gone. So is that the brick wall, do you think, or a brick in the wall around reparations?
It's one of them. I mean, I think that we had some very fanciful discussions around it. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's our friend from Howard, he, did a wonderful job in sort of making this case for reparations in the Atlantic. And looking at not just the slavery era, he was looking at all the policies that replaced slavery and that could sort of conspire to target Black people and keep us isolated racially and economically in this country. And that was sort of the farthest that we've sort of seen it go. Hilary Beckles, who I quote from quite a bit in my book, he has led the effort for Caribbean nations to receive reparations. And that process actually started back in 2013. Like he published his book, Britain's Black Debt, in 2013. He also gave an address to Parliament. And he was interested in furthering that dialogue. I mean, I think in the UK, because you have all these fantastic records, it's very easy for me to trace my name and look and see what they owe. And in the United States, so much of that is buried. Yeah. And we don't know, it's like an accident that we know that these Georgetown Jesuit ministers did this. There was never any sort of systematic way to sort of do that. But in both cases, there's a brick wall. And we spend our time talking about these aggrieved white people and their feelings and their loss of privileges. And there's a huge privileging of their needs and real amnesia, ignoring. Like, we don't even ask the question of our needs. And my fear is with this new administration that's coming in is that we hide and we don't continue those conversations. Like, we have to, like, this is fact.
Yes.
This is history. These are evidence. Like, these are things that are true. So we have to sort of stick to them and not be afraid, to just stay on them and keep pushing the issue. Sometimes it takes going back into history, because as we talked about it, I'm thinking about this and the difference in the Civil War, and like, man, those people are still mad about that.
Still mad. And my one of my dear friends and mentors, Hector Sanchez Flores, with the National Compadres Network, he says, we all have at least 7 generations of memory in us. We all have historical memory that long. So folks may not know why they kind of knee-jerk pulled the lever in one way or another, the way they did in the election. But it is never disconnected from that generational memory that we all carry. So when we talk about the schools today, and you've been heavily involved and you've been doing a lot of research about education in this country and the schools, when you think about the current structures, traditional public schools, public charters, private schools, even, where do you see that kind of generational memory reflected?
One of the projects that I did in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and I was, again, shocked, first of all, that it's Bloomingdale. My neighborhood was a plantation, and there were slaves working that plantation. It was a whole estate. They were growing things. Like, why did I only just know that now?
Yeah.
And
why isn't there a plaque?
Where's
the plaque?
Yeah, and nobody at Howard seems to know that either. So I'm like, how do we know? So that a lot of these things have been suppressed, and nobody really wants to know. So that was one of the first things. But then, moving toward a lot of our research, we looked at when desegregation happened in Washington, D.C. 1952, the playgrounds are desegregated. 54 is Brown v. Board of Education. Within 5 years, 90% of the white people leave Bloomingdale. This specific neighborhood.
Yeah.
They leave. And so a lot of our narrative is about the riots and civil rights movement. That's what pushed. No, actually, it was much simpler what pushed white people out.
Yeah.
They simply did not want to share their public space with Black people. And so they left en masse. And now we're seeing, in the last few years, we've been experiencing a return, which has also coincided with a real push towards privatizing the system. And so the system is mostly privatized.
So they don't have to share their space.
They do not have to share their space. And, it's all cloaked in terms of choice and, you have choices and everything. Well, no, actually what happens under a privatized system is that the people running the schools have the choice. And so they get to decide who comes in or who comes out. So a reporter from the Post emailed me today because they're saying under the new administration that they're already talking about expanding the voucher program. But I was pretty shocked to hear this. Not just continuing what's existing, which they give a certain number of low-income families in DC get a voucher to go into the private school. They want to expand it to everyone.
To expand the voucher program to everybody. Resident of DC?
Yes.
Meaning that anyone, low income,
middle income, everybody
has access to these vouchers.
Yes. So I'm sure they would have to means test it and everything, but so this is one of the ideas that have sort of been floating, which is so if the justification behind the voucher program, which is fraught, but if the justification is that low-income children don't have access to the same quality education as kids who go to private school, then what is the justification for saying that anybody can go to a private school with public money? Well, I think we're in a post-justification
stage.
Post-truth. I don't know. So I didn't hear anything more from that. But I mean, to me, it's sort of like we've been dancing around this thing and we've been bleeding out public education in the city in a slow death. A little bit by little, we close one school, we close a batch this year, we close a batch that year. We open up a new school, we sort of flooding the market with private options or privately run options. And so that's been sort of a slow process over the years to where we've killed about half, it's because we've got half of the kids, public school kids are in privately managed schools. And then half of public school kids are in charters. And this is sort of just like a gloves off. Like why are we even pretending like we want to do we just want a private. We want
let's not even use low income as a proxy.
We just think private is better. Public doesn't work, right? Public doesn't work. Meanwhile, we've been in this experiment for 20 years. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and the most recent scores that came out showed DC, and I'm laughing to keep from crying because it's not even funny. 25% of DC public and charter schools are college ready.
1 in 4.
So how has this investment worked for us already?
20 years.
And why would we want to double down on that investment? That's not smart investment.
And in fact, expand our investment by opening it to everyone.
Yeah, if you open up to you're really just saying, as I told the reporter, you're just throwing the white flag up. And you're saying, you know what? Racial, economic segregation, we don't care. Because the whole thing about private management is that the people running the schools have the choice. So it's like if you're in the 70s and you're a Black person, you're trying to get access to a Trump hotel. It is up to him whether he lets you in or not.
Yeah.
Even if you're the government paying for that voucher, there's nothing you can tell them. If they only want to let one Black person or no Black people into their school, that is their choice because they are privately run. So, the idea of unleashing all of DC school children to the forces, these private market forces, they're hostile to poor people of color right now.
Yes. And the notion of desegregation, integration, closing achievement gaps and opportunity gaps, all of that. Right. All of that has been public. And the initiatives behind those things have been public.
And they've all been public. And then they also, to go back to that 1954 situation, they're all trying to ameliorate the choices of white people. White people make a choice en masse that they don't want to be a part of the system. And so all of these remedies that come about to say, hey, this is one system. Let's all, so they decide they don't want to be a system. They either move to all white communities or they put their children in private schools. They get into very exclusive communities. And in any case, they're excluding people of color, people of limited means. And some of us are positioned to be able to navigate these things. There's always going to be a few. And actually, we're sitting in a room there too. We'll be able to navigate it. But we are still at the mercy and whim of these forces. Either one of our children could be kicked out and we have no recourse, really. There's nothing that we can do. And that's something that, as you know, in your work, that happens quite a bit. We know that there's bias. And I'm sure this study was public school kids in New Orleans. Oh, yeah. So we know there's bias even in the public system. The private system, which has no expectation of accountability there.
Or structures to even measure.
They can grade unfairly. They can admit people at a whim, deciding who they want in, who they don't want in. They can kick out people, deciding who they want in, who they don't. And so you're once again putting us at the mercy of the whims of white people and white institutions and no public accountability for that. So it's very depressing. So, again, I'm just going to try to do what I've always done, which is to just call it as I'm seeing it. So we shall see whether this thing gets any further. It seems like when we scream and yell, they like that even more. But I think
have no other. That's all we got to do
for the public record. People have to know that this is what you're doing. This is what the impact has already been. This is what history has already shown us, and this is this is the decision that you're making despite that. And beyond that, we just have to figure out how to help our children, our communities sort of survive whatever is coming.
I will say, just to end on a note of hope, that I have really been fueled lately by our grantees, the organizations that we support who, at the ground level are turning inward and they're turning to the local work that has to happen on the ground. On that fateful Tuesday, we saw in Massachusetts and Georgia initiatives that were defeated that were really intended to expand charter schools because, I think our groups really helped to build a narrative about privatization and what that really means for communities, and didn't at all have the resources to match the money that was going into really kind of supporting these initiatives that did not pass. So
that's fantastic.
That's happening at the local level, and I think that there's a lot of conversation now about how locally the groups can be focused so that they can be ready for 4 years from now to really retake the reins and to bring the federal government back in as a partner. So I think there's hope, as India Ari says.
I'm glad to hear that. I did not hear about that. So I want to know that story. That is inspiring. So the work that you all do here at the Communities for Just Schools, it's more important than ever. I hope you double down. I hope all of your grantees double down. And I hope that the fund continues to grow because civil society is the only hope actually right now. So I think it's kind of great you're not in the government anymore.
I know.
A number of reasons, but I mean, civil society is much bigger, and it can be as powerful as the federal government and who's running it. And so it's going to be really important for philanthropy to stand up, to get up and get in there.
Natalie, I could talk to you all day. But thank you.
Thank you for having me so much.
This was fun. Where can folks find you if they want to reach out to you online?
I am on Twitter. Mostly. I'm also, I'm on Howard University's website.
Thank you, Natalie, for joining us on SchoolHouse, and thanks to all of you for listening. Remember that you can follow me on Twitter at Allison R. Brown and sign up for the Communities for Just Schools Fund newsletter at cjsfund.org. Have a wonderful week.